To the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for bringing me in.
I know that you were head of a very important institution at some point in South Africa, the Institute of Race Relations, for quite some time. How long did you preside for over it? Was it 10 years?
I was there in total for more than 10, and about 7 or 8 as its CEO.
And in total?
In total, I must have been there for probably 16 years, 17 years.
Almost half of South Africa's democratic era.
Yeah.
Okay. And and that means you left at which year?
I would have left probably about 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe as a point of introduction is say something to us about where you are now, and we know the project of Institute of Race Relations. Where are you now, and what's the project of Cronje Private?
Well, all I am is an analyst.
Analyst.
And all that I think analysts should do is you look at a lot of data and a lot of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I learned in the IRR era, because it had a very strong research capacity. And was actually a very good training ground to be disciplined on understanding the world through data and numbers. And I think good analysts, whether you work on the economy or on the political world, the rules are the same, very good data. Then talk to real people and understand what they are trying to tell you and how they see the world. I think a lot of analysts make the mistake of saying, it makes no sense. This person is mad. You should try very hard to think until you understand the reason, the logic behind the ideas of the person or the group, the party, the country, the economy that you're studying. And then you put those two things together, and if you at the same time have a sound understanding of history, then you can make good calls, and the calls can explain why something is happening in a society. And if you do that really well, you can get to the holy grail of all this kind of work, which is to try and tell whoever listens to you what is going to happen next.
Okay, methodologically, I get that. I mean, South Africa has been a subject of your research, thinking for all your career, it seems.
Yes.
And maybe then, because that's what I want us to partly speak about, is an interesting critique you give to not South Africa in the last 30 years, but a sort of point of departure about let us understand what is this place that we call South Africa. Can you just canvas for us those grounds, the union as a space, how old it is, and the significance of that for majority of understanding it as a research entity, as a research object.
Yeah. One of the points we might make in this conversation as we go on is to ask the question of whether the union will hold together. I think that's now a fundamental question on South Africa. And what that refers to is a set of events about 110 years ago that saw the two Boer republics and the two British colonies come out of the consequences of the conflict in the late 1800s, 1900s, and culminated at a point in 1910 where what is today seen as the modern South African state is thrown together. And those four entities which don't have a great deal in common with each other, and naturally are formed together in what becomes the Union. And that becomes the modern South Africa and the way we think about the country today. And I think something that not enough people appreciate is that the Union is very young. It's only 110 years old. And it's been held together throughout its history by very strong nationalist type administrations sitting in Pretoria and holding it together. And a very interesting South African question now, given the position of the African National Congress, which is under pressure politically, is what happens if that strong nationalist administration in Pretoria falters? What happens if we become a country where that kind of entity is no longer present? And not to hold people in suspense, one of the arguments we make is that what happens is the union itself begins to fragment and undo itself. So you might think of coming through the full circle of history, that South Africa's reached a point now where the question of the state of the place is can the union itself hold together? And if it doesn't, what does that mean? And what kind of society does what we think of as South Africa today become?
This question, it seems to me, would have threatened the union in the 90s. It would have been a big question. That, like we are talking about it now, crisis-ridden apartheid state, under international pressure, all types of fantasies, leading, for instance, de Klerk to decisively say we've got to change the plateau and accept that apartheid must fall. Someone like you and me could have said, for instance, in 1990, before the speech, the speech of the release of Nelson Mandela, the unbanning of political parties, and say things might fall apart. Why would they not fall apart? These are motivations, for instance, that result into all types of divisions within the ruling class, the white ruling class. Some still insisting you can keep apartheid together. Some saying we've got to go fully democratic. Up to the Bruremach that still had this fantasy that no, you can expel all the blacks to Zimbabwe and keep the space for yourself. Perhaps too, I think that provides a good foundation for the conversation. Can the union, will the union hold together? 1994, a new administration takes over. Are you saying by all standards, this administration in 1994 had all the signs, if we were standing in 1994, had all the signs that it could do what had been done since 1910, which is to hold the space together?
Well, it's an interesting question that you asked. Why didn't it fragment in the early 90s? And as I sit here thinking about it, I think there are two things. One is a small thing and the other is a big thing. The small thing is a famous answer that a senior Afrikaner military officer put to the white right as they were entertaining these ideas of going it alone. And essentially he said to them, right, he said, you want to take the country, you want to seize it, we can do that. We could do it this afternoon. And he said, tomorrow morning, what will you do with it? Will you govern it? And that put an end to the idea. That was the small thing. The big thing was, which is why I was particularly pleased to receive your invitation, given your connection to President Mbeki and his foundation, is that the new South African administration, on coming to power in its first decade or 15 years, achieves far more in success than it ever receives credit for. And the argument I'd make to you is that we must go into those successes, because even today they're not understood. It's quite mad. The consequence of those successes is that the ANC, through the first 15 years, maybe into the first 20 years, is able to become a strong centrist nationalist administration and therefore hold the union together. And not strength in the sense of cruelty. You must think of strength broadly. There were such massive improvements in the basic living standards of millions of people. That is strength. The fiscal position, we'll get into that. That strengthened. Living standards picture transformed fundamentally. And so that is the little reason, which is a very small one, and then the big reason we're getting to are probably the two reasons why the union held through the transition of 30 years ago. and then we'll get some, perhaps in the course of things, to the position today. And I think once we've gone through what happened in the decade after 94, 15 years, we'll actually have a very good foundation from which to ask the question of whether that might happen again, and if it doesn't, what the consequences are going to be.
But you have this pretty strong ANC as an important aspect that does these things.
Yeah.
And these things, which we are going to get into now, hold the union together.
They're crucial.
Up to this point,
Yeah, crucial.
also
Strong ANC.
let's go into them. So 1994, Madiba takes over. 1999, Mbeki takes over. 2008, he's out. President Kgalema holds a bit. President Zuma comes in from 2009 to 2018, and Ramaphosa from 2018 to now. Pretty good picture of eras through presidents. Perhaps then take me through this era you call a sort of consolidation, or an important era of holding the union together, that actually the union is still a viable idea.
Yeah. So the ANC is now assuming power. It's inheriting an economic catastrophe. South Africa had last seen high levels of economic growth through the 1950s and 1960s. The instability of the 70s had introduced vast volatility into economic growth, and the 80s see extremely volatile and low rates of growth. As a consequence, the ANC on day one, let's go to day one, it inherits, remember by those standards, not by present day standards, it inherits a debt to GDP ratio of 49%. Just more than a decade later, 13 years later, it has cut debt to GDP in half.
For the sake of a very average viewer, what is the significance of that line item? Debt to GDP at 50 or 49%.
Well, by today's standards, it's very low globally. But by those standards, it was somewhat higher. And it's the best way to think of it. It's not really different to the finances of a household. That if you're heavily indebted, you might be forced to borrow. And if you're forced to borrow, the borrower might place conditions upon you. And my understanding was that early on, ANC thinkers understood that the debt position they're inheriting from the last apartheid administration is so serious that if they are not able to address that, they might be forced to borrow. And if they're forced to borrow in dollars, the revolution will be over, because the budget speech will in time be dictated from Washington. And that's a very powerful motivation to improve the fiscal health of the country. So debt is cut in half. The flip side of debt is a number called the budget deficit. That's the difference between what the government spends and what it earns in revenue. And it's no different to your household budget. And the ANC, on coming to power, inherits a very deep deficit. So -7 or 6%. And it's 7 times a multiple of the rate of economic growth. 13 years later, as the debt curve has come down, the deficit has turned into a surplus, and the state is earning more in revenue than what it is spending. And it does that essentially for 3 consecutive years, really 2005, 6, 7, 8. That was the first multi-year surplus since the formation of the Union of South Africa.
Since 1910.
Since 1910. Now, if you're critical of that, this is very conservative macroeconomic management. You might say, well, what are these guys doing? I mean, they're meant to be liberating the country, alleviating the dire socioeconomic circumstances, and they're busy balancing the budget. Remarkable thing is that through that same period, the number of people in employment will increase from 8 million in 1994 to 15 million by the time Mr. Mbeki departs as leader of the party and of the country. Through that era, if you recall the time, you would have read in the press about jobless growth. It was terrible jobless growth, and the jobless growth meant the country hadn't made any progress, and later it was used in the diagnosis of Mr. Mbeki's departure. It was complete nonsense. If I'd written his speeches at the time, I'd comfortably have written that the time in office of Mr. Mbeki, first as de facto prime minister to Mr. Mandela, and later as president, saw us double the number of people in employment. At the same time as doing that, South Africa rolls out the most expansive welfare program of any emerging market. The number of people who are receiving some cash payment from the state every month increases from about 3 million in 94 to around 12 million by the time Mr. Mbeki departs. But this is being achieved through the saving on the government's interest bill. Because as your debt, as in a household, as your debt comes off, which he has achieved in government, so your interest payments reduce. And the saving on the interest bill is redirected into starting the social welfare program. So you're doubling the number of people in employment. You're expanding access to welfare from 2 to 12 million people. And then you can have whatever view you wish on welfare, but what you can't do is say that that didn't do a vast amount of good to alleviate the very worst aspects of poverty experienced by people. Then we get to the question of service delivery of this era. It failed if you read the press. You read the press today, which you should be very wary of doing. You'll read about the failed service delivery. In those years, you read about it all the time. And that was nonsense too. On our first night as a democracy, if you imagine it that way, it makes it more real. 49% of families went to bed without an electrical connection to their home. So you close that door that night on this dark house, maybe a candle lamp or something.
Or a paraffin
little
light.
paraffin light.
Yeah.
49%. In 2008, that had come down to under 20%. It was 19%. No emerging market has ever matched the scale of the service delivery successes recorded in South Africa's first decade and a bit after 1994. On the question of, let's go, you might think I'd cherry-picked the three things that worked. In that first decade, 10 formal houses were built in the country for every one shack that was newly erected, despite a huge flow of people to urban areas and another trend that compounded demand, which was that household size in South Africa fell by a third. Because when people become more prosperous, the size of a household shrinks, and that adds to demand. The point of all of it is to say, and I can go on and list more of these things, the murder rate after 94, it was inherited at 94 at 67 per 100,000. That means that 67 people were murdered in the country in 1994 for every 100,000 people that were in the country. That bottomed out at 31, I think, around 2008. So wherever you look, the macroeconomic management, the fiscal position, the debt position, the deficit position, the job creation position, the social welfare rollout, the service delivery position, all of this is seeing an absolutely astonishing improvement in the basic living standards of people. And you can quibble at that if you wish and say that RDP houses fell down and that this wasn't good enough and that welfare is not the way to the future, all of which is fine. But in doing so, you mustn't get away from the key point that on a macro level, South Africa's first 15 years saw a vast lift in the basic living standards of millions of its people. And it was universal. I loosely worked on a project long ago with the great Afrikaner historian Herman Gilliameer, who'd written the book The Afrikaners. And Gilliameer and I estimated that in the 20 years after 94, Afrikaner living standards might have risen faster than in any 20-year block of South Africa's history going back to the end of the Boer War. So there's this universal lift in society. And as you introduced me in my sort of alma mater of research organizations, I was fortunate there that we were surrounded by some very excellent people and who were very interested in this sort of thing. And we went to explore some of the consequences. And one striking consequence was that the share of protest actions in the country that are violent had reduced from somewhere around 15 to 20% in 94 to around 7% in, I think, about a decade later. And at the same time, the vote share of the ANC in Parliament, which in the end there's a scoreboard in politics, and you look at that after an election, decide how you've done. The ANC in 2004 is 6 percentage points stronger than when Mr. Mandela had led it in South Africa to liberation in 94. And therefore, to answer your question, the early success, the strength that's projected by that early ANC and the cumulative consequences of the vast increase of living standards across the board it absolutely locks in the strength of the union. And if you hadn't been if you didn't know a lot and you looked into 2000 and let's say that era, you might have thought this will last forever. But there were weaknesses that had, of course, emerged. So that's why the union held.
I want to pick up on 2 points. The first one is this interesting comparison that you were busy with Khiliomi about. The Afrikaner separatist, supremacist state, white supremacist state in relation to the poor white problem that had actually become a very, very key fascination even for intellectuals in America. And then the other thing I want to look at is to canvass your ideas on what went wrong. Before we do that, I think we must take a little bit of time to tease out more, because I know that there are other aspects, such as the middle class, which you provide in interesting ways using cars, the number of people who have the capacity to buy a car, but also per capita income. Can we just go through all those aspects? Because I think they're going to be important later.
Yeah.
About this sort of first Madiba Mbeki era.
Yeah. You certainly see the beginnings of the emergence of a middle class. And there's no real formal definition of that in South Africa. So typically what we've done over the years is looked at car sales or households that are able to buy a car, or whether you own a home via a bond. Because if you just look at plain home ownership in South Africa, you see the consequences of state-led housing delivery. So you must ask the question, were you able to borrow money from a bank in order to afford your home? One of the most striking numbers I've always thought underneath the middle class that sort of summed up what was starting to happen is that I think it was in 1991 there were 44 whites that got a degree in engineering for every one black graduate. So 44 to 1. And into the middle 2000s, I don't recall the year exactly, but it's 15 years into democracy, that figure has changed. And the ratio now favors black engineering graduates. But the number of white graduates isn't materially less than it had been in 1991. So you do see the beginnings of this rise of the middle class. It was very important not to overestimate what that meant, because there's enormous difference, and we're seeing it in the politics of the country now, between a first generation and a multi-generation middle class. A first generation middle class, very difficult thing to be, because you carry this burden of history.
You're the first to get a university degree. Then you're the first to actually get a professional paying job. But now the situation is saying there could be maybe 4 in a single household, or 3 people like that now.
Yeah. So once you become a multi-generational middle class, and you're the child of people who were middle
Where
class,
I
and you're
see
also middle class.
multi-generational. Yeah.
Once you're in the multi-generation of middle class, you become socially a completely different phenomenon. So just as an interesting aside, whether you're multi-generational middle class in South Africa today is as good a predictor of anything as which party you're going to vote for in an election. So as soon as you develop that second generation, a lot of things change in your society. So we had, we were on the way to something. Way to think of where we were on the way to. It's an estimate created by my colleague Mbeki, and Mbeki estimates that let's say nothing had changed, there hadn't been a global financial crisis, and let's say South Africa's rate of economic growth had continued at what it was between 2004 and 7. Beki's suggestion is that had that occurred, then today the unemployment rate would not be over 30%, it would be closer to 10%. And the number of people in employment would be approaching at 10 million more, at 17 million, might have been 27 million. The country might have been a very, very different place. But of course, that is not what happened. And South Africa, having been set up on this trajectory and taking off on it, of course, things were interrupted.
I grew up in the radical, sort of critical sections of the ANC. The biggest criticism, as I recall it, you mentioned it earlier, jobless growth. And you're now sitting here, and I think I can estimate a lot of very renowned intellectuals who would have made this claim. And we can check later, but one of the interesting books, interesting studies at the time, interesting thinkers would have been like Seekings and Natras. So what is the real confusion? Is it just an outright economic lie, ignoring the data? How is it that we could have reached a conclusion of such magnanimous of a claim when the data doesn't support it?
Yeah, I've always struggled with the answer to that. The one thing I do fall back on is that I'm surprised that the state and the ANC of that era didn't make more of this in its own defense. And very often over the years.
Is it maybe because global average growth and employment numbers by comparison, South Africa was still ridiculously high?
No. We were still, we were making great progress. If you read the numbers correctly, you could see that. I've been surprised over the years, it even continues into the present, that you might even come across a contemporary ANC leader who, when you put some of this to him, responds as if he has not heard it before. I think later on, this would be after 2008, the narrative takes hold that everything has been a failure. It's all a failure. No progress has ever been made. What did you expect if the ANC took over? Of course, it was never going to. I think so. So let's look at parts of the answer. Part is, I'm surprised the administration didn't latch onto it sufficiently. I think part of the explanation is that there was a very strong assumption in the sort of, let's call it the subculture of society, that of course it wouldn't work in 1994. Of course it would be a failure. Look to the north, 50 failures. How is it possible that the ANC and government could make a success? I think the view from the West was one of great skepticism. So that is I think another thing that happened, and I'm slightly out of my depth in making this statement, but it doesn't worry me, is that there had been a deep schism, or a certain schism, within the sort of ideological matrix of the ANC, and the manner in which some of these successes were being recorded, the fiscal prudence that I've discussed, that I thought was very wise, but escaped the trap of the dollar borrowing, was written off as a betrayal of the sort of ideals of what the revolution should be. So within the movement, there's pressure to say, look, it's jobless growth, because there's this reluctance to see that there is progress being made, factions involved in this sort of thing. Failed delivery. Why are you from the left of the ANC? I can recall it. The criticism was very sharp. That why aren't you blowing out the deficit and borrowing more? Why are you worried about global institutions? And I've never thought that and it continues into the present. It just got worse over time. That South Africa's diplomats and state communications people, I didn't think were very good at their jobs. So I'd say perhaps you were getting to a lot of the reason between the idea that there was an assumption that obviously it would fail, it had to. There was an internal conflict, ideological conflict around the ANC that was reluctant to give credit, certainly the full due credit, for what was occurring, and there was also just within the state a basic communications weakness, and between those three reasons, you probably get some of the way to the answer of why it continues 30 years later that I sit here with you and say things about our progress as a country that some of the people watching this might find very different to what they are routinely told, in fact, really occurred.
Okay. Just one last detail there before we cross over. There's also the stuff about energy, because energy is going to be critical to the question of the survival of the union at a later stage. What happens in that era to the question of energy?
Well, if you draw a chart of it, it's quite straightforward that insufficient new energy infrastructure is either is being brought online or defunct. We're quite strong on the argument that South Africa's old coal plants are fine. They can be 50, 60 years old, but we have excellent engineers. They can work for another 20 or 30 years. Too much of that plant and equipment is allowed to be taken out of commission when it reaches its supposed end of life stage. And the energy production line for the country starts to run into the demand line. And that happens around 2008, 2006, 7, 8. We then go through the global financial crisis. The ANC then has its internal political realignment, and Mr. Mbeki is removed, and Mr. Zuma's era has begun. And it's the joint effect of all of those things coming together at once, which have the consequence of undoing the trajectory that the country had once been so strongly on.
Can I request you? I mean, I don't know how much you will be able to do this now. Is the same sort of factors by comparison to the era after? What happens to those categories in the era after? But also, you seem to make a claim as well that the performance on some of those performance areas, that era outperforms the entire history of the union. Literally, Mbeki, we could say, is the first president to preside over a surplus, a budget surplus, since 1910. But what other factors are we able to sort of, if we were to squeeze it in between, This was at this stage before, it went to this stage after, and it went to this stage later on.
Well, perhaps the one number I haven't mentioned, I should have, is the foundational number in some respects. And that's something called the fixed investment rate. And what that measures is how much fixed capital, so hard money, is being committed to new projects in South Africa in a year as a share of the size of the overall economy. Now, when the ANC came to power in 94, the number they inherited from the previous regime was 15%.
1.5.
And around 2008, the number is 4, 5, 6. It's fighting its way to 20. It's broken through 20%. It's reached 22, and it's threatening 23%. That's very important because our emerging market peers average fixed investment rates 25% of GDP and up to around 30, and at moments even more. We were well on our way to that, and as a consequence of which we generated the growth that made possible the revenue and the job creation and lifting. And when I speak of our emerging market peers, it matters not at all whether they are liberal democracies, and as far as there are any, or anything else. The more autocratic societies have often found it easier to hold high levels of fixed investment because they can take firm, sensible decisions. And we've taken that number up to about 22. Through the financial crisis, the number collapsed. So 2008, the global financial crisis, the fixed investment figure falls back to 15%. It never picked up again. And it has stayed at 14 or 15% ever since, and it remains there today. Now, at 15%, the fixed investment number, we think, is perfectly consistent with the idea of the South African economy growing at around 1%. If we lift it from 15%, where we are now, if we lift it from 15% to 25%, the effect will be to raise the rate of economic growth back to 5% and above, up to 4% and above 25% to 5%. We'll be back on the track that we were before. And then we should record in a generation that same progress on unemployment that I suggested we would have been at today. So you might say that underneath everything, the fixed investment rate is the foundation. I sometimes say if a politician comes to see me and says, what do investors think? Or they said they were confident. Investors are always confident, but the economy doesn't grow, as Mr. Ramaphosa recently observed. And I would say to the politician, particularly if they're one of the ruling administration politicians, I'd say, look at the fixed investment rate. That tells you what business and investors really think about you. And if the investment rate's 15% and they tell you they're full of confidence, they are lying to you. And at moments I've felt, not sorry for, but I've had some sympathy with senior administration leaders here over the last 15 years who are continually told, we have great confidence in you, carry on, you're a great reformer, this is it, great confidence. And the fixed investment rate.
This is interesting. Okay. I want to go back to the explanations that get canvassed. I recently spoke to the outgoing CEO of the GSC. And she, when I put the growth rate of the pre-financial crisis, 2008 years, to her, but we were averaging 4%. At some point, the economy grew as close as 6%. And she said, well, that's just because of the commodities growth, commodities boom. What do you say to that? I mean, it was just the East was industrializing. There was a huge demand for commodities. That has never happened again. That's really what accounts for the economic growth of that era, not all these things of that you are explaining.
I don't I mean, I liked her a lot, and I wish her well in her new pursuit. But no, I don't think that that works. The administration took advantage of the circumstances that it inherited, and did well as a consequence. There's a scoreboard for a country, like at the end of a sports game. There's a scoreboard, and the scoreboard on South Africa was what I've set out for you. I don't need to do it again. And the fact that there was a commodities boom meant that to some extent the administration took advantage of it. As you and I sit here today, the United States and China are tearing each other to pieces on rare earth minerals and critical minerals. It is an enormous opportunity for South Africa to exploit. But mining production data came out earlier this morning. We are down again on a 5-year trend of production volumes falling. We could have positioned ourselves as a potential middle power in a multipolar world. I sometimes say South Africa's greatest asset today is its geostrategic location, the naval base at Simonstown. We could trade that, if we wish to, for vast investment concessions from Western and Eastern powers alike, if we chose to do that. I disagree with what Leila said, because the administration then took advantage of the circumstances of the world. They might have taken more advantage, if you wish to be critical, but they took advantage. The trouble today is not that there isn't a boom, but we're not taking advantage of the circumstances that are around us. And the way I'll win the argument with her if she was here, and she's very, very nice, is this, that our emerging market peers have for the past decade all grown at 4 times the rate of what we grew at here. And if you look into the future, the forecasts of any economist you choose to look for show that our emerging market peers, the countries who are like us, will grow at 4 times the rate as we are. And so their growth rates aren't determined by the vagaries of commodity super cycles. And ours wasn't either, and it's still the case. We are not in this. We spoke before this. We had a very interesting chat, and I mentioned that I thought some of South Africa's politicians were meek. The thing you remind me of here is, I think, a critical thing for the country to come right. Do we have an internal, external locus of control? Are we a country that allow things to happen to us from outside, and there's nothing we can do about it, or not much? Or are we a country that takes the circumstances we have, and we have an internal locus of control, and we make a success of it? Because if you want to split the two eras, and we still have to get to the second one, the first era, to a very great extent, reflected an administration that had an internal locus of control. Too much that's coming out of the second era after 94, post-2008, is an administration that says, it was tough out there. There's nothing we could have done. And that, I think, is very disappointing, because it's false. It's not true.
And then the last point about that era, I mean, I'm just canvassing all forms of criticisms as I can remember them. The job people would say maybe it was an era full of jobs, but they were precarious jobs, meaning the type of a job that at the end of the day is not quite a job. Lots of outsourcing, which means your labor contract and your salary is so low, your labor contract is so uncertain, that what you're really getting by is getting paid enough to come back to work, getting paid enough to eat enough to work, no capacity to save and all of that. But also that, then you can engage in these other decent things, medical aid. You don't have a pension fund. You don't also have capacity to buy a house, to buy this and all of that. The status of the jobs, I think, is one of the big criticisms. How would you deal with that?
I would concede the point. the cliche is the story of the woman who must get up at 3:30 in the morning to get a taxi, to catch another one, to catch another one, to get to a place of work, where she spends her day on her knees scrubbing the bathrooms of her employer, and then spends half her wages trying to get home again. Her kids have put themselves to bed. That story is typical of a lot of the employment of that era. And no one can dispute that or argue with it. However, when you were a society in which 8 million people had a job, and you're now a society in which 15 million people had a job, you're a society that is making progress, hard progress, difficult progress, progress that still see people suffer immensely. But I suppose that relative to what the ANC inherited, this long era of colonial rule, the on balance, could you have jumped from what you inherited to what's, let's say, called decent work, and done that immediately? I don't think that was an option that the ANC had. And I think given what it, and people don't appreciate what it inherited, the absolute mess. And the need to, particularly younger people today, a bit blasé about the era, and therefore quite critical of it. Why didn't the people who sat there in those negotiations do better? I think, given the hand that the ANC was dealt, and I think carefully about your comment here on the jobs, given the hand it was dealt, I'm still willing to say that on balance, it did extremely well to begin a process of emancipation that it never received the credit for.
Last criticism. This fixed investment ratio, it's at 23% at its height, at its best performing in that era. You're saying global average was 25 to 30% of the emerging markets.
Yeah.
Still fairly well. It hasn't performed that well in the last 15 years. It's stayed at 15%. And you're saying we must use that to measure the confidence of capital, of investors.
It's a very good measure, yes.
Yeah. But also there was a big problem about that era related to the fact that there is no investment. Rupert's interview is what I want to recall here with Kevin Mukari, where he says, the reality of the matter is that we didn't believe our luck. We should have invested more. But you argue that that was already 23%. That was very, very high.
Well, it was on the way to where it
And
needed.
President Mbeki sits somewhere most of the time thinking, I did everything right. Inflation, stable economy, stable country, stable politics, growth is stable. Why didn't I get more investment?
Well, I think he did well on investment. I remember in the middle, the investment number initially recovers. Then it gets knocked flat by the Asian financial crisis in 1998. So you've started getting this process going as the new administration. Then you get an external event that just knocks emerging
The Asian
markets.
financial crisis.
So now you've got to start again in 99, 2000.
This is interesting. I mean, it was not global. I'm sorry to interject. In the story, most of the time of the economic history of the short economic history of South Africa, we don't speak of the Asian financial crisis. Maybe people know the global financial crisis, 2008. It's in the West. It's the West financial crisis. That's why it was global. But just give a sense of to what extent was it important as a crisis, its impact on the South African or global economy?
Well, it contaminated emerging market sentiment. It turned off appetite for risk, as these things tend to do, and high risk emerging markets or countries that are rated as such immediately bear the brunt. So you start this recovery process, you get knocked back by this thing, you got to wash that out of your system. It takes 18 months. You've then got to recommence, which happens. So and it makes my story even better, that you've been knocked down early on, you've got up again, then you've started. If you've lifted your fixed investment rate on the back of the Asian crisis to approaching emerging market averages within a decade, you've done extremely well. And had none of that been interrupted, had the energy crisis not played out, the global crisis, had the young South African administration had the benefit that more autocratic societies do, that you can rule over the long term without continuously being interrupted by various kinds of elections, then we were certainly on a track where we could have taken the number, hold it at 25 and above, and even take it to 30%. So it was a high rate of investment.
This is gonna be an interesting reflection for the old man, that because I certainly would have never interpreted it that way. That is the measure of whether these guys believe in you or not. We don't look at the pledges.
Don't look
We look at the actual.
Never look at the pledges. There's nothing as awful as business people setting off for a poor community to sign a pledge before fleeing back to their where they came from. And another way to think about the whole era, if you want a kind of overhead number, through the years of Mr. Mandela and Mr. Mbeki, South Africa created 500,000 net new jobs per year. Through the era of Mr. Zuma, that was 250,000. Through the era of Mr. Ramaphosa, we haven't held the number above 100,000. It's 20% of what was previously done.
Actually, 60%, 60,000 jobs a year.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go then. Economic policy, I don't know if you would concede, in terms of economic policy, there's nothing that changed between the two eras.
No, I wouldn't concede that.
Okay. Is there fundamental rethinking of economic policy praxis from 2008?
I think that posturing on elements of policy rattle confidence amongst investors. Remember, lots of things happen at the same time. So I think that starts to happen. This is the era that will take us into the mining charter that really put that industry off. This is the era that will introduce the idea of expropriation ever more, that absolutely terrifies investors, particularly when there are already preconceptions in place. So you're rattling confidence. At the same time, there's now an energy cap on the rate of economic growth, because not enough is being done to refit defunct coal plants. So that is starting to occur. And the world has in 2008 gone through the bigger financial crisis. There's also a very negative perception towards Mr. Zuma and his administration. The collective consequence of all those things keeps the fixed investment rate down. As a consequence, the rate of growth is down. And as a consequence of that, whereas about 15 million people went to work on Mr. Mbeki's last day in the office, now, how many years later are we now? 15, 17 million. 2 million net new jobs over that period, whereas we doubled the number of people in employment in the first period. And the share of families without electricity would stagnate which had improved so very quickly, would stagnate after 2008, and over the last 5 or 6 years has begun to lift. We're losing the ground we once had, and that happens universally to living standards indicators. across the country. As that happened, if you go back to those old indicators we read in my sort of training years at the IRR, we see that the share of protest actions that are violent is starting to increase again. And that was an extremely important thing. And I think the ANC administration after 2008 makes a terrible mistake in not recognizing in the protests what they should. That the protests are ANC voters saying, hey, it's been good, but it's not what it was. And just, hey, we're here, see us. And I forget in what year it happened, but the milestone for me that made me think the ANC's in serious trouble was, you of course remember it very well, the shooting of a chap called Andries Tutane in Vicksburg. Now he's in a protest, this was typical of these things, and he's a big, strong guy, you know, and he rips off his shirt, literally, and a policeman shoots him in the chest with a shotgun, and he's killed. He dies shortly after. And the SABC, the state broadcaster, public broadcaster, if you wish to be in nuance, screens this that evening. I can remember watching that and thinking, good God, what is the thinking here? This is suicidal. So the protests are beginning to lift very strongly. At the time, people would come and see us to ask about the country's prospects, and North Africa has happened, the Arab Spring uprising. And particularly Westerners would say to us, is your country going the same way? Look at the protests. And we said, no, it's not, because people will change a society down the line of least resistance. They'll do the easiest thing they can to change. And the easiest thing initially to do is to just take to the streets and say, hey, you know, here we are. Have you forgotten about us? Take us seriously. Tutane is shot to death on the state broadcaster as a consequence. Mad. And we said, no, this won't go the North Africa way. What will happen here is the protest will reach a peak level, at which point further protest is actually difficult, even destructive to your community. You know, in times of unrest, the bulk of South Africa doesn't retreat to its paddle club in order to see it out. And what will likely happen is the next easiest thing to do is that voter patterns will begin to change. And at the time we said that, it was a revolutionary idea. That what do you mean? People will vote differently, because the cliche had been of liberation loyalty voting, which was to say that ANC voters will vote for the ANC because that is what they do. And that will never change. This was one of these ideas like jobless growth and failed service delivery, absolute certainty. And we had, by that stage, developed an alternative view. We'd said the reason ANC support was up as high as it was in the 2004 election is because the ANC in government is doing a pretty decent job from the mess it's inherited of starting the emancipation of people. And people are not voting on liberation loyalty. They are voting on their material circumstances. And this is what we're seeing in the protest movement. And if the protest movement reached some kind of a peak, which in a sense it did with the events in Natal two and a bit years ago, the voting pattern will begin to shift. So it was all very predictable what would occur, and is now what has occurred. And if you sort of think back on all of it, that number we discussed earlier, the 500,000 jobs per year of the Mandela and Mbeki years, the 250,000 of Zuma, the well under 100,000 of Mr. Ramaphosa. You know, you might ask someone, what did you think was going to happen in these circumstances?
The Ramaphosa was supposed to be a gear shift, certainly towards some billionaire taking over, some interestingly recovery route. I mean, he's well beyond 5 years on that seat since 2018. So we're speaking about 7 years in office, more or less, and now you have what I think was the greatest test in the democratic South Africa, which is the ANC going to 40%, and without a single drop of blood, people just negotiated power, and you've got the GNU. But I've heard you speak about, and this is where we started, that the union might not hold. I mean, you're making this statement under the government of the real union.
No.
We have not had this complexion in a South African government before, where a predominantly white political party is in a coalition with a liberation movement. The D and the ANC is the administration under which you actually are giving a caution that things actually might fall apart. I want to ask about that. But earlier on, when we were speaking about the difference between the previous era, Mbeki Mandela, and Zuma Ramaphosa, because this one now is the GNU sort of era. But you said South Africa didn't have or doesn't have the advantage of autocratic regimes, in that you had said that prior before I asked you about if there was a shift in policy praxis. Your sense was autocrats would have held longer if that had happened here, if that had attained here. Then you would have had the type of successes that are predicted by your colleague, unemployment at as low as 10%, maybe 16%, if it's worse. Per capita income would have doubled to what it is now. And unemployment would have, well, it's the same point, but you quantify the jobs to what, 17 million, you say. All these things would have happened, and your sense, the word you used was, if we were an autocratic society. What are you pointing at there?
Well, I mean, a lot of my liberal friends don't like the argument, which is tough because you've got to counter it. There are very few examples since the end of the Second World War of a country that was terribly poor, as we were 30 years ago. We remain poor in many respects. That then became completely free, as we are now. We can do here whatever one chooses to do, and then became rich. The typical chain of events was you were very poor, you became autocratic with a thinking administration. You then became wealthy, and now you deal with the consequences of whether you wish to have a representative government. So who are the great reformers that have, since the end of the Second World War, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty? It's Park in Korea. It's Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. I once had this discussion with a senior Singaporean. I said, you were autocratic, and he said, we weren't. And I said, well, he didn't like that at all. He said, we were completely democratic, but there were very strict rules about what you were allowed to do. So I said, well, I'll give you that one. That's fine. Deng after Mao in China. Perhaps
Deng
Kagame,
Xiaoping, yeah.
perhaps Kagame in Rwanda to a certain extent. Maybe in some respects, what Trump in the fullness of time will deliver in America, and that point stands. It's true. There are not many examples of poor places became completely free and then became rich. And the problem is this. Let's make it about the ANC. The ANC has for 30 years had to contest an election every 18 months, either an internal one or a local government one, or a national government one. Those are complex and difficult environments. You have to make all sorts of concessions. You don't have the room always to force difficult policy decisions onto a society in the face of ill-informed opposition, and that is a disadvantage. In South Africa's case, the disadvantage is exacerbated by a great story on Chapman's Peak, this mountain pass in Cape Town, wanted to build something, and I can't remember. There was a group of protesters who protested, and two old ladies handcuffed themselves to the scaffolding, so this project couldn't go ahead. It was a small story, but it's a very good example of what has often got in the way of the kinds of decisions that are needed. The oil industry, hounded out of South Africa by green activists, the appalling behavior of European diplomats who come here and tell us that we must turn off our coal-fired power stations because they in Europe feel uncomfortable about such things, when our environmental problem is 20 million unemployed people. And yet, if you're an environmental activist here, you can hold up the entire oil industry through your activism. That's great. We're a free and open society, but you mustn't just write that off. But you also mustn't say you don't pay a very severe price for that kind of behavior, which we now read in our continuing very high levels of poverty, and where we're going with this conversation, what the implications of that and the fullness of time may be for the union to hold together.
The ANC should have chosen to keep its 1999 to 2007 leadership. It sounds to me, you do know what happened in Polokwane.
You may.
Polokwane is a debate whether Mbeki continues as the president, and then he's contested by Zuma. Zuma wins. But there is a very important section of people in the ANC that said we need to continue with TM.
Yeah.
Is this a coincidence, or
No, I don't think it's a coincidence entirely. I think it contributed to that perfect storm of these very severe energy difficulties, the consequences of the global fallout, the change of leadership. And then just beyond the change of leadership, how Mr. Zuma was perceived in the West as someone who did not belong in the rarefied air that and was perceived by corporate South Africa as not that kind of person.
but then what's the difference between him and Cyril?
Well,
If it stands that Zuma had these disadvantages, semi-illiterate and not conversant with world-class economics, but also maybe all other weaknesses, what's the difference? Why is Ramaphosa, in his 8 years before the GNU, produces worse results?
Well, Zuma suffers from the energy question, of course, and he suffers from this the question, let's say, prejudice that's directed at him because of his background. When in many respects the life he's lived has been quite extraordinary. To think where he started in the world and where he ended. It can't just happen by accident. You don't accidentally become the leader, or always accidentally become the leader of the ANC. Why has this difficult environment continued under Mr. Ramaphosa? Well, one is the question of the energy cap is still in place. I'd say to some extent exacerbated by his leadership. he's been far too willing to go along with the green ideologies dictated upon South Africa from abroad. At times, I can't help but thinking that it is as if the administration believes we are a colony, and that point I made about these ghastly European diplomats who have the arrogance to say turn off. You haven't. One group recently said you haven't moved fast enough yet to turn off. Would they take a thing that cuts and go and cut off the electricity to the home of a person or two there? Because that's in practice what they demand of us. So he hasn't got energy right. On the question of policy and confidence, he's got very little right at all. He suffers very much, I think, from what I suggested to you earlier, that there are always elements of elite society that will say, you've done so very well, and we have such confidence, but you don't see it in the fixed investment numbers.
What is he doing, though, in your, I mean, could you weave this future of enclaves into his, is he driving us towards this disintegrated country
I think
that is holding at enclaves?
It's been a long time. It's been a long time coming, and so I think he's been unable to just finish. He's been unable to solve the energy problem, and greatly exacerbated it in the era of Andre de Ruyter, who should never have been appointed CEO of Eskom, and has not been able to. I think in trying to always split the difference, straddle the middle ground, unite mutually annihilating objectives with each other. Confidence never lifted, and so fixed investment didn't as well, even though he was championed as a great reformer, because he was perceived differently to Zuma, because Zuma had been perceived in what was, in addition to the reality, split it from the reality. Zuma had been perceived by the sort of rarefied elites of the West, and perhaps here too, as not the kind of person who should lead a country. Mr. Ramaphosa was perceived and elevated by them as exactly the kind of person, but in a material sense never introduces the requisite steps in government.
But with the energy question, how consistent are we here? Because energy stabilized towards 2010. That's why we were able to deliver the World Cup. The problems of energy, actually, in the scale of its dramatic levels, are associated with the post-2018 era.
Emergency measures taken for the World Cup and running plants and equipment very hot get us through the World Cup in good shape. Subsequently, we avoid the worst excesses of load shedding until later, because the rate of investment and growth is so very low. So the demand is simply not strong enough to knock out the lights. Then we commit fully to the green transition. And the plan's going to be, we're going to take the failing coal fleet, that curve, and we're going to let it run out into a great green transition, and we'll be celebrated.
That's an interesting take.
Will be celebrated in Scandinavia. And
so the energy
and
crisis,
then we get into the load shedding crisis.
But that's 7 years. Say 2010, energy stabilizes. There are two commissioned projects. Some of their aspects kick in. But also you've got this 7 years of stable energy supply, 2010 to 2017, before 2000 and 2000
yeah, so stable, but in an environment of very low growth, following which the rate of breakdown of Eskom plant and equipment will begin to accelerate further. And a strategy becomes
so your sense is what breaks it down. It's not so much economic growth, but it's deliberate. It's a decision. Green energy.
I think it's the energy starting to fail. Low growth keeps the lights on for a time after the World Cup. then the plant and equipment starts to fail. And Eskom produces very good data on this, and the rate of breakdown of Eskom's coal plants just begins to accelerate on its own.
I see.
And the view becomes, well, that's fine. We'll just let that happen, because if the faster this happens, the faster we can get away from coal and please the overlords in Brussels. And then the strategy becomes this huge commitment to a green transition. It's absolutely catastrophic, costs the ANC an election as much as anything else. And thereafter, the new minister is appointed and talks to the coal station managers at Eskom, and they're getting the support they need. As a consequence of which the availability factor is the number that measures what share of Eskom plant and equipment is operating as it should, which had on 3 occasions after 2015 hit, or actually 2020,
Yes.
hit levels of 50%, just below, has now been taken back comfortably to 60%. There's a target next year to take it beyond that and to approach 70. And that can be done. I mean, this point must be made as well. That can be done. South Africa has more than enough defunct coal stations standing somewhere in the veld that can be refitted by South African engineers and can then be restarted so that they will produce energy. To the extent that if we do that and refit the defunct coal plants, we will be able to produce an energy surplus sufficient to reinvigorate the steel industry in the country. The coal energy argument draws further strength from the fact that there is a significant surplus capacity on the electrical grid running from the north to the south of the country, because that's the grid that was built for the coal fleets. If we wish to do all of this through solar power, there is zero surplus grid capacity running from the west of the country, the zone of greatest solar radiation, into the east. So it's critical. It's critical to refit the coal plants and to generate the surplus. And until you've done that, you can't actually talk much about raising the fixed investment rate. Because you could bring an investment tour to South Africa. You could say, commit to us, and they'd say, what is the energy estimate? And we'll say, well, maybe if you come and invest, we might fix the energy that might make build it and they will come. Generate a surplus of energy, and they will come in. And the people get cross about the coal argument because they're wrapped up in the environmental stuff, which is fine. But my counter to them would be to say that even if you believe all of that the world is about to end, which it's not, but even if you were to believe that, surely you can appreciate this argument that South Africa, to hold itself together as a unitary state, requires now to replicate the living standards improvements that it first saw after 1994. And to do that, to bring our unemployment rate down from 30-something to 10%, the global average this year is 5%, we need to vastly invest in raising the amount of electricity produced within the country. And so even if you were to make the climate argument with me, I would say to you, fine, I don't buy it, but give us a break as South Africa. Give us 10 years to use the plant and infrastructure and grid we already have to start improving the lives of desperately poor people who suffer so much. And at that point in the future, let's look at in our own rate, on our own terms, as a sovereign nation,
on our own pace.
At our own pace, we will start to move, if we believe it's appropriate to do so, towards cleaner forms of energy. And then you can hold the union together. Failing that, you've been trying to take me to enclaves, and I haven't gotten there yet, so I'll go there very quickly. You said under the GNU, I suggest the place might fall apart. I suggest the union might fracture. But the enclaves are a more complex phenomena than that. What the enclaves are is this, that as that strong central state begins to fail, it withdraws. The things the state can do, that a state you might think should do, it starts to fail at. And as it starts to fail and withdraw out of communities and people's lives, whether in the provision of policing or a fire department in Johannesburg, a vacuum isn't left. People start to appropriate state functions for themselves, and they start to do it on their own. And in South Africa, that is happening at a massive scale. And our argument is this, that if we do not have a strong centrist nationalist administration at the head of the government, again here in Pretoria, ruling over us, this is an inevitable evolution of the country. And there'll still be a South Africa. You'll still find it on a map. You'll still have a passport. You'll still pay tax. You'll still do all of those things. But the elites will increasingly begin to withdraw to where they live in islands, of fortified islands, of great comfort and prosperity, as is already apparent. And perhaps in rural areas, traditional leaders will begin to appropriate for themselves powers that were once the powers of the state. And perhaps in peri-urban areas, what we saw during the Natal protests will occur more, where powerful actors like a taxi industry might begin to appropriate for themselves powers and authority. And Pretoria the union buildings will govern over its gardens and the fence. And outside, if you wish to get something done, you'll talk to the local leader of the taxi industry, or you'll talk to a traditional leader, or you'll talk to the local head of the farmers union, or you will stand at the gate of the golf estate saying that you have a right to go in here too.
A warrant of arrest.
And
they will stop you because
you don't have a right to be there. And South Africa will, in that sense, fragment, and it will balkanize, and sort of break up of the old Soviet Union and so on. Not in a sense that these places will be independent in a formal way, but they will afford the people who live within their boundaries very different kinds of experiences of life in the country. And sometimes some of the sort of libertarians think this is wonderful because we'll be free of the state. And
of the centrist.
We'll be free of the state. But it's not wonderful, because if you are the head of the farmers union, you'll be a very powerful person. If you are the head of the taxi association, you'll be a very powerful person. If you chair the body corporate of the golf estate, you'll be a powerful person in society. But if you're just an ordinary person, you will be a vassal that will kind of will exist underneath the authority of these kinds of actors. So it's actually not a wonderful utopian outcome for a society.
It is also, it seems to me, I mean, I'm canvassing the same logic. I don't think it's in the best interest of these individuals you're speaking about. Maybe in the 19th century, you could conceive of a corner where you live in the world. But the international system now is much more connected, that to act within it by way of competition, you could be annihilated without a strong nation state. You would just be facing bigger actors than you that are prepared because they've got the might of the states behind them. The Boer republics fell because the British republics had the might of an entire global power. And they told them, you're going to toe the line. If you don't, we annihilate you. There are those threats. There has to be an acting on a global platform of some sort, which, as you say, The United States is at the moment seriously fantasizing of an autocratic order. And few European countries as well, that we also, in a way, will only be able to withstand the East by becoming the East, by becoming powerful central governments. And there is no way to say, if you are this weak actor, I was telling you earlier about the 1800s, 1700s, I think, Thomas Piketty pulls this example of China. In the say, by all Adam Smith rules, China should have been that China of the Ming Dynasty. Should actually have been a more successful because they've got low taxes, they've got a very weak central state, free market, and but because of the weaknesses of the state is too weak to protect against invasion. It is too weak to act against bullies in the world. And most of these bullies are the ruling classes of other worlds, are the heads of the estates, the owners of mines, so on. Those are the bullies who constitute a very large nation state with a large capacity for violence. Either they've got nuclear weapons. These days, the debates are around artificial intelligence, capacity to fight very, very remote wars. They no longer take people, it's the drones. But now we might actually be looking at physical robots. But in a sense, this is not a very desirable future, even in the interest of somebody who wants an enclave for themselves. They may not last too long, maybe.
Right. Our argument is, for a nation state, you're right, I'd agree with you. But the enclaves arise when the nation states collapse.
Mhm.
And our argument on the enclaves is they become incredibly strong because the strength of the enclave is proportional to the weakness of the state. If the state is a little bit weak, the enclave is a little bit strong. If the state is completely weak, the enclave is completely robust and long term. And if I was to speak at a wealth seminar or something, I say to South Africa's elites, I'm very confident that the enclaves will allow you a long permanent presence in the country where you'll live very comfortably. Because you made the critical point now that a monopoly on the use of violence is the definition of a modern state. Now, in South Africa, 30 years ago, there were 370 people in the country for every one policeman. And today there are 450 people for every one policeman. 30 years ago...
What is that ratio in the US?
I think it's about 300 to 1.
300,000 people.
300 people to one policeman. And here it was 350, now it's 450.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing that I recall the US number being around 300.
Mm-hmm. Let me allow this to go because I know you're going to the security company.
The private security industry number in 94 was 360. It's now 100 to 1.
What is that number in the US?
Not sure. But in South Africa's case, the private security industry are not guarding convenience stores from shoplifting. They're serious operators.
In South Africa?
In South Africa's case. It's a different kind of industry. South Africa's private industry now contains the best of the police and the defense force. The air capacity to fly choppers vastly eclipses what the Air Force and the police can put up. The capacity extends way beyond response to sophisticated intelligence work and the like, aimed at controlling criminal violence, not at anything else. But the point is that even if the US ratios are in the zone better than the South Africa's private security industry is an alternative to the state.
At an enclave
And
level,
therefore,
you argue.
Well, at an enclave level, certainly, because it's the middle classes and the business community that's guarded. So you do have a monopoly on the use of force. Secondly, the elites have dollarized themselves and will increasingly do so.
Let's stop a bit there. Those are not monopoly. The security industry in the US is massive. Private security. It's massive in most of European countries. It is a function of well-advanced capitalist communities with even capacity for innovation. I mean, what Elon Musk is running is a security apparatus. He's got some of the largest contracts with the military in the US because of his capacity for weapons innovation on the one hand, but he's developing things that in the security. That's why Rupert stands in the Oval Office and says, "We need you, Elon," because of his innovative. He's way advanced than than the U.S. military from an innovation point of view of weapon systems. The difference between Elon Musk, even if there were 53 of them or 500,000 of them, is the word monopoly. Is that the security industry would still have to get under one room to become the South African single arm.
Which they won't. So they don't challenge
Which
the
they won't.
authority of the central, but the central state has ceded its control. The enclaves have become these fortified sort of country clubs, and within their world, you could, some of these estates that are being built just around where we are in Johannesburg now is a place that you could be born within the walls and die within the walls. You'd never have to leave. It's an entire self-contained.
But things have to come in there. They have to be secure on the roads. They have to secure on the seas. They have to be secured in the sky.
Yeah.
But also, the threats of there are only so many people we can kill. There has to be a resolution of disputes. So the justice system needs to be there. There must be a judge that listens to who is offended by somebody that may not come from your community, but even worse, if they come from inside the enclaves. But thirdly, you still also, quite frankly, just as a practicality, like I don't know. I mean, what would be a perfect example of such a community here in South Africa? People like the Afrikaner town. Maybe it is the first enclave. I don't know. The famous place where they try to have their own currency and all of that.
Yes.
Orania.
Yes.
Yeah. Even if you were to, quite frankly, have an Orania, the connectivity of the world. That's why you've got an entire diplomatic industry of diplomats, because the world has to interact on goods and services, movement of people, and all of that. You still need to, at the core, secure those things. And you possibly have to secure them with the consent of the others.
My argument is they do all of those things. Orania is a very weak level of enclave. It doesn't have nearly the same kind of fortifications or the substantive depth as these private estates. People are rude about Orania, but if you live in a walled Gulf estate, you've done exactly the same thing in some respects. Now, the enclaves appropriate, is the argument, later all the functions of the state. What about foreign policy in South Africa today? There are every month a delegation of non-state actors flying across the United States and conducting diplomacy.
But are they successful?
I think they're very influential.
But are they successful? They are negotiating. They're negotiating it seems to me, even if we were to agree, but it's really not in the best interest. Before it's not in the best interest of ordinary people. I don't see a thinking person, rich, smart, who has a Gulf estate somewhere, rationally arriving at the conclusion that even the protection of that arrangement, to be able to live in that way, it seems to me they require very, in the least, central government with a massive capacity for violence. It is actually in the best interest of the enclaves rather than.
What the best interest is something else. What happens if the state continues to weaken is the enclaves
Okay,
deepen. I don't think the people that live within the enclaves do so because they were the primary instigator of the phenomena. I think progressively as the state, outside my office now, they park sometimes a blue fire engine, which is a private fire engine, and when I grew up in Johannesburg, there weren't such things. Now there are. So my argument is the reality, the consequence of state weakness is enclave formation.
Okay.
And if the state were effective in its core functions, South Africa would remain comfortably a unitary state without the enclave phenomenon. But it's a consequence of the weakness. If the weakness accelerates, the enclaves will get stronger. If the weakness recedes, the enclaves will slow their evolution.
Is or evolution. They seem to be an offshoot of having to adapt, it seems.
Yes.
But I mean, I guess that was my trouble there in the beginning, was whether you are advocating or you are saying this is the eventual sort of consequence of a weakening central state.
What I'd say is if you're very rich, it doesn't, and you don't care about the world around you, you don't have a social conscience, then you can relax because you can live in an enclave. However, what I advocate for is that it's extremely important to make sure that the unitary state in South Africa survives. Because if it does not survive, there is very little prospect that millions of people will escape. If you're the elite middle class and you don't care, let's say you've said, I'm shutting myself off, I don't care, I don't want to know. You can live in an enclave and have a fantastic life. And I'm pretty sure that's going to last long into the future, and that at some point a cabinet minister will become your neighbor. So I'm confident in that. But I think it's extremely important because of the nature of it that the unitary state does survive, and that it's extremely dangerous that this point has been reached, because millions and millions of people get left behind in terrible suffering. And in the fullness of time, if that is left unchecked, the consequences for the stability of the greater whole will be great. And then to maintain your enclave, you will have to engage in behaviors and security and the like that
Cronje, for you, it's a very interesting conversation we've had. I mean, the former CEO of the South Africa's Institute of Race Relations, firstly, hopes that maybe what we needed in 2007 was an autocracy. We may have survived the catastrophe that followed.
And an enlightened.
Doesn't matter, it's autocratic nonetheless. Secondly, you are now advancing an argument against the best of liberal demands, that we need as minimum the role of a state in our affairs as possible. I mean, you say that liberals would celebrate the enclaves in a way because they are irritated by a strong state. How do I reconcile you with the good old classic liberals from IRR?
I suppose the thing to do is to how one reaches this point is you read the society as carefully as you possibly can. You understand where it's going. So the enclaves are where it is going, not what you wish to happen or not is really very secondary. It's where it's going, and then I suppose you have to decide whether you care greatly about that or not, and if you do, and the consequences, and you feel you wouldn't be comfortable living in a society where people live in such terrible poverty, you would reach the conclusion that what must happen here is a sincere attempt must be undertaken to secure the future of the Union. I suppose that's what leads you here. This has been a very great pleasure.
It's a pleasure, Zolma. I see the possibility of a second conversation because it would be interesting to canvas South Africa on a global platform, and whether the world is becoming a multipolar world or just the reemergence of two powerful, bipolar entities around which the rest of the world is mobilized. I don't think it's very, very clear, and people on the international scale often want to act on the pretext that it's becoming multipolar. That might just be a transition into something else, but certainly it's been a great pleasure. And I thank you
very
deeply
much
for creating time.
Thank you.
Thank you.